Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Metropolis Radio. Today we are taking a look at the Screenrant article, and I know it's a few days old, but I think it's still quite relevant, and that is streaming can't be blamed for post-pandemic box office performance. Theater owners blamed Black Widow's second weekend drop-off slump on Disney Plus Premier Access, but streaming isn't the biggest or only factor. Now, this article goes into four separate points that we will tackle. So more than like every other time I've done, every time I've done a video like this, it's going to be a bit of a slower burn. So, buckle in, boys and girls. This one's going to be a doozy. Black Widow suffered a massive drop its second weekend at the domestic box office, and the National Association of Theater Owners, aka NATO, which is a terrible name, and I've already brought that up, is blaming Disney Plus Premier Access, but streaming can't be blamed for the post-pandemic box office drop just yet. Even with Scarlett Johansson's case against Disney for making Black Widow a dual release still ringing loudly across the industry, movies are finally coming back after massive delays and an abysmal 2020 box office due to the coronavirus pandemic. A few new releases have even had some big wins at the box office, although theatrical revenue is still far below pre-pandemic levels. While the box office appears to be in recovery, and some analysts have projected a recovery by 2025, we have yet to see the true impact of coronavirus on the theater industry or find out what kind of new normal to expect from the box office going forward. And I do think that, the analysts projecting a recovery by 2025 is being incredibly generous. I'm actually arguing that we're not going to really see the damage of the lockdowns up until 2025 once we have quite a few years of data to suggest really what the damage has been. But changes to audience purchasing behavior, Hollywood production delays, shorter exclusive theatrical windows, and more will have a lasting impact on theater revenues. And with only a few big 2021 movies and an uncertain future due to coronavirus variants, we're still learning about post-pandemic box office behavior. While we don't know the full impact of the various factors impacting the box office, we do have enough data to show to know streaming releases aren't the only or even the biggest culprit, if there's a culprit at all. Thanks to our knowledge of historical consumer behavior and the small sample of new releases, we know that while theaters do need to better adapt to compete with streaming, it's not to blame for Black Widow or any other 2021 release yet. Now, let's get into this first point here, and that is to make note of. Fast and Furious 9 had the same second weekend drop even without streaming. In the letter released by the National Association of Theater Owners, the first paragraph points to Black Widow's weaker than expected opening weekend and stunning second weekend collapse. No, it wasn't because the movie released at the wrong time. Had it released in 2016 or 2017, probably would have done gangbusters. No, it's all COVID's fault. But let's get back to it. Weaker than expected opening weekend and stunning second weekend collapse as evidence of its underperformance. The letter compares it to Fast and Furious 9 and A Quiet Place Part 2, concluding Black Widow would have opened at $92 to $100 million if it weren't for the fact that it was simultaneously released in theaters and on Disney Plus Premier Access. Again, I think that's being overly generous, but whatever. These trade groups tend to be really over generous with their estimates at times. However, while Black Widow's box office numbers look weak compared to the pre-pandemic box office, it's right on par with other post-pandemic releases. In fact, it opened higher than Fast and Furious 9 and had almost the exact same second weekend drop, 67.8% versus 67.2% for Fast and Furious 9, even though Fast and Furious 9 didn't have a simultaneous streaming release. The previous two main series Fast and Furious movies crossed $1 billion at the global box office and beat the Marvel Cinematic movies released in their respective years. So, Black Widow outperforming Fast and Furious 9 is actually an improvement, if anything. Fast and Furious 9's opening weekend domestic box office was just 71% of Fate of the Furious' domestic opening in 2017, while Black Widow's $80,366,312 opening is 86% of Spider-Man Far From Home, which went on to surpass $1 billion globally. and $5 million more than Ant-Man and the Wasp. The major outlier is the other recent Marvel solo movie, Captain Marvel, which opened with nearly twice as much as Black Widow, but it's hard to know if that's a fair comparison, as Captain Marvel's arrival in the MCU was teased in the Avengers Infinity War post-credits scene, and Captain Marvel was marketed as a major setup for Avengers Endgame. Spoiler alert, Captain Marvel was not really integral to Avengers Endgame, but at least they're bringing up these circumstances. A lot of publications would try to hide behind the fact, oh, but you see, Captain Marvel, opened with twice as much as Black Widow did, but they will never look at the circumstances that led to that. Not to mention the fact it was the first women-led MCU movie. I don't think that had really anything to do with its box office gross. I think the hype for Avengers Endgame played more into that personally. Whereas Black Widow feels years too late. I've been saying this. Had it released in 2016, 2017 at the latest, it would have probably done gangbusters. But the fact that it originally was going to release in 2020, it feels like 4 years too late. Well, now 5 years too late. And with her dying in Avengers Endgame, it feels like more of a footnote for a second-tier MCU character than it does major setup for the future of the franchise, so direct comparisons there may not be valid. They aren't fucking valid. As we pointed out, Captain Marvel had other circumstances that led to its benefit that Black Widow simply doesn't have. And no, it's not COVID's fucking fault here. Also, with a 55.1% third weekend drop, Black Widow remains on par for post-pandemic releases. Streaming availability or no, both Fast and Furious 9: A Quiet Place Part 2 had bigger drops than their predecessors in the second weekend, but then had better legs than from weekend 3 onward. Black Widow's 55.1% third weekend drop is close enough to Spider-Man Far From Home's 53.3% drop to seem to be in a good place, although Ant-Man and the Wasp and Captain Marvel both had much better third weekend drops, so it's still too early to know. Now let's get into the second point here, and that is families viewing Black Widow on Disney Plus Premier Access doesn't necessarily mean lost tickets. NATO also blamed families who may have seen Black Widow at home by paying $30 for Disney Plus Premier Access, saying Disney didn't necessarily see the same revenue per viewer from Black Widow estimated $60 million in Premier Access streaming, since each family member wouldn't be buying a ticket if they saw it on Disney Plus, like they would if they all saw it in a theater. The problem with this argument, unnecessary inconvenience and expenses expected from families aside, is there's no audience segmentation data to show this, and the logic of the argument could just as easily go the opposite direction. That is very true. How much of Black Widow's streaming at home audience were families seeing the movie? We simply don't know. There's no way to tell. Theaters are expensive for families. Oh yes, they are, especially nowadays. Theaters are expensive for families, and the cost of taking the whole family really adds up if there are multiple kids, especially if you include concessions. Yeah, if you include concessions, you're spending about $100 to $150 to go see Black Widow on the big screen, or you can pay $30 to get it on Disney Plus Premier Access. Spend about $5-10 on a 24-pack of Orville Redenbacher, and you're pretty much good to go. Not to mention the inconvenience of getting the whole family to the theater and supervising small children, or the potential added cost of childcare for any children who stay home. The $30 for Premier Access is more than enough incentive for families to see the movie opening weekend when they would normally wait until Black Widow's home release. There's no way for NATO to know if the people seeing the movie on Premier Access would have gone to see it in theaters and simply waited for a physical media or streaming release of Disney Plus Premier Access hadn't made streaming from home an option. I remember video game companies back in 2013, 2014, they were defending the use of DRM, where it's like, oh, if we put DRM on all of our games so no one can pirate it, that means every single person has to buy the game. When there was no way for them to know how many people who were pirating the game even had any intention of buying a legitimate copy or not. So, the same logic applies here. The logic is incredibly flawed. Granted, there's no data for this argument either, but the price and convenience appeal for families is significant enough that at the very least blunts the argument that the whole $60 million would have gone to the box office to be shared by theaters instead. NATO does point out that the $60 million is a global figure and shouldn't be compared to the domestic box office. However, they also don't connect the dots on their own argument to then reduce their own claims of lost domestic theatrical revenue. So yeah, how much money did you... So yeah, NATO, how much money did the movie theaters really lose? You know, you can't say that, oh, we lost $60 million. Well, that's a global number. So how much that $60 million came from the United States? We simply don't know. And here's the third point. Black Widow's piracy is not to blame for lost theatrical revenue. Hey, we're going back to piracy, as I just mentioned a minute ago. NATO also points to Black Widow's piracy numbers, claiming the Disney Plus Premier Access release allowed for HD copies of Black Widow to spread almost immediately upon release, driving it to the top of most pirated movie charts. Again, how many people who are downloading Black Widow off of these special websites that you can spend just 5 minutes on any search engine and find? I'm not going to tell you how to find them. I can't legally do that. But how many people who are downloading the pirated copies of Black Widow were going to pay to see it to begin with? Again, there's no way for you to know. Piracy is certainly a problem, but it's not uncommon for the number one movie in the world to also be the number one pirated movie. That happened, I believe, with Fast and Furious 6. It also happened with X-Men Origins Wolverine, where the work print released, I think, 6 weeks prior to that movie coming out, yet that movie still made a shit ton of money despite it being garbage. So, yeah. Oh, also, what the theaters are basically doing, they're taking the Expendables 3 route, is basically, oh, the full movie leaked online 6 weeks early, that's why the Expendables 3 bombed. It's not the fact that it was a PG-13 entry into an R-rated franchise. No, it's because everybody pirated the damn thing. Yeah, regardless of quality, Avengers Endgame was the most pirated movie the week after its release, and Captain Marvel was the fourth most pirated movie after its release, and in both instances, it was a copy recorded by a camcorder in a theater, so the quality doesn't appear to play much of a role in the likelihood of it being pirated. No shit. In fact, some people will go ahead and download the camcorder recording in the theater. Some people will wait for the screener copies to get out there because the screener copies are higher quality. Now, I'm not saying that I ever dabbled into this world. I'm just saying I know I maybe know some people, and I'm pleading the fifth after this. NATO also pointed to other simultaneous releases that top piracy charts as additional proof, particularly HBO Max's releases. However, with HBO Max only available in the United States at the time, and theaters not fully open around the world, it's a ripe situation for piracy, with the only option for much of the world with closed theaters to see some movies via piracy. In fact, history has shown piracy is typically more of a matter of convenience than of cost. Yes, Gabe Newell of Valve has been saying this for the last 15 years. When music piracy was first becoming a problem, attempts to combat piracy were far less effective at reducing the problem than making music available for easier digital purchase. Yes, if we just sue Napster into the ground, that means that the MP3 technology is dead. Oh shit. LimeWire, Kazaa, Morpheus, BearShare, all coming up and taking the market. Let's just sue everybody. Yeah, how'd that work out for the music industry? Oh, that's right. They obliterated half their value because of all the fucking litigation. Once Spotify and other streaming music services became available, the amount of piracy occurring began to reduce. According to a 2018 YouGov survey, found that of people who quit pirating music, 63% had switched to streaming services, citing both ease of access and cost as factors in their decision. Logically, this behavior should follow for video streaming. It did. In fact, Redpoint claimed growth in streaming services had largely killed torrenting in 2018, going on to say that there has been an uptick in recent years. However, data suggests the uptick is in geographic areas where certain content isn't available on streaming and or average incomes are low enough that streaming services are still cost prohibitive. Yes, so basically, fracturing the home video streaming market probably wasn't a good idea. Whereas when you had just Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Hulu hosting like 95% of the content, piracy was an issue. Now it's starting to uptick again. Now we're starting to enter into the second golden age of piracy. In either case, that particular uptick in torrenting doesn't represent lost revenue, since the consumer couldn't purchase the content if they wanted to due to either price or availability. Exactly. Now here's the fourth and final point that this article brings up. NATO is upset about theater monetization, not movie monetization. The most important thing to keep in mind with NATO's letter is the source. NATO serves as a representative for theaters in the United States, so their primary concern isn't whether or not movies are making money, but whether or not they're making money in a way that theaters share a slice of. Of course, theater owners are going to point fingers at streaming every chance they can to explain low box office, because streaming is its biggest competitor, especially when streaming is edging in long-held exclusive theatrical windows, which were cut in half in response to the pandemic. The NATO release is titled Black Widow Shows Theatrical Exclusivity is the Way Forward, and it ends with a condemnation of simultaneous streaming releases, but if an entire industry's survival depends on artificial exclusivity and simply cutting any competition out of the equation, it may be time to rethink the business model. Exactly. If your entire business model is basically just, buying exclusivity. I remember when Blockbuster did that. This was many, many moons ago, where Blockbuster for certain movies was buying a 28-day exclusivity where they'll get certain movies. Like, I remember they did that for the movie Harsh Times with Christian Bale, and I actually have the Blockbuster exclusive, DVD, the actual disc that has Blockbuster exclusive on it. Basically, so Netflix and Redbox couldn't get their hands on it. So Blockbuster for the first month of release would be the only game in town to rent the movie. Did it save Blockbuster at the time? It might have for about a year or two, but Blockbuster still went under. While Johansson is understandably upset by the idea of lost revenue, the solution isn't necessarily killing simultaneous releases, but rather fixing the deals talent are signed to, and Disney's alleged breach of contract should be the matter at hand there. In terms of rethinking the model, first of all, theatrical exclusive windows won't be financially appealing to studios who have their own streaming services, as many streaming platforms now see revenue that eclipses the studio's box office haul, and studios keep a larger percentage of that revenue. It's also worse for consumers who would see reduced access and, in many cases, higher prices to new releases. It seems the only entity that truly benefits from exclusive theatrical windows are the theaters themselves, which suggests it's a time for theaters to find better ways to compete. The situation is unfortunate, as the theatrical industry took a massive hit from the pandemic, which we've reported on several times at this point, and the big screen experience is a cultural touchstone that deserves to survive. The box office rebound we're seeing with movies like Black Widow shows how much audiences still value going to theaters, even if it's not in pre-pandemic numbers. But theaters were already seeing waning attendance for nearly 2 decades before the pandemic hit. And again, even I've brought up this point time and time again. It's not like COVID killed the theaters. The theaters' problems extend far, far back. COVID didn't help the situation, but it sure as hell accelerated their downfall. Meaning even anti-consumer moves like bolstering exclusive windows and price increases won't save them in the long run. Theaters need to learn from their streaming competition by competing on things like price, access, and experience instead of relying on exclusivity to save them. And I do largely agree with this article, is that it seems like, streaming has just been unnecessarily used as a scapegoat for movie theaters to acknowledge that, it's not that our business model is dying. It's just streaming is pure evil, and it's not gonna benefit anybody. Well, what I have to say to that is time will tell. And guys, I'm gonna go ahead and end it right here because I think I've gone on as long as I need to go. Thanks so much for sticking around. If you stuck around this long, thanks so much for doing so. And if you've been following me long enough, I'm terrible at ending these videos, so I will just see you guys next time.